Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
You need to have a vision of where you're going to be, what you're going to do, and I would say it needs to be an eternal vision.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Measuring Success Right. My name is Jake Conlin, and I'll be your host today. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Marianna Richardson. Dr. Richardson is currently the Director of Communications for the G20 Interfaith Forum and serves on their Antiracism initiative. She's also an adjunct professor at the Marriott School of Business and Management Communication and the editor-in-chief of the Marriott Student Review, a student-run peer-reviewed journal. She's also the faculty advisor for this podcast, Measuring Success Right. She was recently awarded the Wendy C. Archibald Meritorious Service Award from the J. Reuben Clark Law School and the Outstanding Adjunct Teaching Award from the Marriott School of Business. She's also on the Advisory Council for the International Center for Law and Religious Studies. She has published books and articles on a variety of subjects. She received her master's degree from Johns Hopkins University and her doctorate from Seattle Pacific University. She and her wonderful husband served in the Brazil Sao Paulo South Mission and are the parents of 12 children and 29 grandchildren. Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for joining us again on the show.
It is so wonderful to be here. Of course, Measuring Success Right is my favorite podcast ever.
For anyone in our audience who hasn't listened to Dr. Richardson's first episode from February of 2019, I strongly recommend it. After re-listening to it myself, I realized that we just barely scratched the surface. You are involved in so many things, so many organizations, and I was hoping to dig deeper into some of those aspects of your life. To start things off, I was hoping you could introduce our audience to the G20 Interfaith Forum. What is that? And maybe could you share some of the insights that you've gained as you've worked with them?
I would love to. I have so enjoyed being a part of this organization. The G20 Interfaith Forum is really an organization that tries to get different faiths together and to talk about policy. And so it's different people who are people of faith or spirituality who also look at really tough situations in the world. We talk a lot about COVID and COVID vaccines. We talk about refugees. We talk about all of the SDGs that the United Nations talks about. SDG is Sustainable Development Goals. And so all of those we look at and we think, all right, as churches, as religions, as people of faith, as people of spirituality, how can we also think about ways to make our world a better place in all these different areas? Now, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is thinking about it in terms of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis has this wonderful analogy where he says that we are all in a house with a variety of doors, and each door represents someone's belief. Our personal challenge is to thoughtfully understand other people's door choices or their choice to stay in the hallway. When you have reached your own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. I love that analogy. I love to find out what other people believe in. I love to also have that feeling of unity as we come together and try to tackle some of these really tough problems in the world, like poverty, women's slavery, all of these kinds of things that we're dealing with. Another great opportunity that I've had is to work with some of these amazing leaders in various religious beliefs and traditions. One person in particular that really struck me was His Eminence Grand Mufti Grabus. And he talked about very specifically how important it is that we understand the different perspectives of religious groups. This is a quote from him. He said, "I realized through my interreligious work, and I feel the same way through this interfaith work that I've been doing, that people often only think about their own religious beliefs. If we want to make a difference, we need to try to understand the beliefs of others. That does not mean that we will change our own religion or that we will convert to another religion. but we have to speak about others' beliefs and understand their perspectives. So for me personally, this has been a fabulous opportunity to be able to understand people's beliefs throughout the world.
Yeah, I just love that analogy you shared from C.S. Lewis. Before we move on, I was hoping we could dig a little bit deeper into what anti-racism looks like at G20.
I so appreciate this question because for me personally, I think that this is something that is so important throughout the world. And it's not just a Black Lives Matters issue, but of course that is a big issue, but it's also other kinds of discrimination that has happened. I mean, I think that we are living in a world where there is more discrimination than ever before. We talk a lot about the 1960s and the civil rights movement. And I think it's really sad to me that in many ways we've gone backwards, that we need to move forwards, especially when we talk about caring for others. One thing that we've done in this anti-racism initiative is to look at all the different kinds of racism that's happening in the world today. Matter of fact, we have an upcoming webinar that we're doing on Indigenous people in general and the racism that's happened. We talk about, happening at the beginning of the United States, but I'm saying it's still very much a part of what's happening. COVID has hit the Native American population particularly, hard. And so we need to reach out. We need to help them. We need to support them rather than having any kind of discrimination against people of any kind. So the positive thing about the anti-racism initiative, though, is to look at that in the realm of some of these other issues. So what kind of racism is there with refugees? What kind of racism is there in poverty? What kind of racism is there in science and technology? And so we see this anti-racism initiative as kind of encompassing all these different areas of the SDGs. So it's not just one issue, but it's an issue that taints so many other things the world is dealing with right now. And it's something that we need to grapple with and see what can we do to make it better.
Absolutely. I love that that's a focus at G20. Shifting gears, I wanted to talk about your role in the Marriott Student Review. Dr. R, I've been able to attend a few international conferences where you've talked about how MSR started, and it's always fascinated me how many professors pay big bucks to come to these conferences to hear about how MSR got started, and how many of these professors are trying to replicate something like MSR at their universities. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the growth that you've seen in the past 3 years with the Marriott Student Review, as well as maybe sharing the story of how MSR got started.
Well, MSR has become a brand, but when it started really small. So the reason for MSR was really because of Kevin Worthen, President Worthen's wonderful talk that he gave in 2016 to all the faculty about how he wanted us as faculty members to really start to focus on inspired learning, which is based on experiential learning, and to allow the students at BYU to have more experiences, real world experiences. And so after his talk, that got my mind just spinning. And I said, okay, from a management communication standpoint, what can I do to help students have this experience? And basically the thought that came into my mind is to first start with a peer-reviewed student journal. I know a lot of other universities have done very similar things where they have a student journal that people can read. Our audience is specifically for business students, but also young professionals in general. We're hoping that people, after they graduate from the Marriott School, will continue to read the Marriott Student Review. But it started very, very tiny. We didn't have much money. We did start as a class, and we have some graduate students and undergrad students that come and take this class, and it's just an experiential class where every semester we put out an issue. And so we're really doing something. But after the first 6 months of doing this, we came to the conclusion that a lot of students weren't reading us. A matter of fact, we're also on Scholars Archive, which is published by B Press, and which is the largest academic digital publisher. And we get to look at digital comments and see who's downloading us. And we found a lot more people around the world were reading us than people at BYU. So we decided to do a little bit of a study. We did a really fun study where we talked to business students and we said, where do you get your business information? And over again, what we heard was that other than what business professors forced them to read, most of them got their business information from podcasts, from listening. And so we said, great. Let's start a podcast. And that was the MSR, Measuring Success Right. We started the podcast. And from the podcast, we also decided to start a business blog because we found that people also read a lot online and really liked business blogs. And on top of that, we also got connected with the management communication group. They have about 800 to 1,000 students in MCOM 320 every semester. And so we get the best business articles that they write in those classes. And we use those for our blogs, but also for our issue. And then we also get others too that people, when they've written something, will send them in. And so we've really enjoyed going from nothing, basically, to being read and listened to all around the world, which is so fun and so exciting. I know, as you've been so involved with Measuring Success Right, in terms of what the numbers have looked like. What kind of numbers have you seen with the podcast?
Yeah, well, it's been a lot of fun to watch MSR's growth. I've been part of MSR for about 2 years now. And if I'm remembering right, after my first year with MSR, we were hovering around 3,000 total downloads for the podcast. And then fast forward a year, and we're about to hit 10,000 downloads. So jumping from 3,000 to 10,000 in just a year, that's been a lot of fun to watch that growth. And I'm about to graduate here in about a month.
It makes me so sad. I don't like to talk about that.
Well, I'm sure going to miss MSR, that's for sure. But once I graduate, I won't be part of MSR anymore, but I'm still going to be super excited and curious to watch how MSR continues to grow. Which brings me to my next question. Where do you see the Marriott Student Review in 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, I've already seen such phenomenal growth. MSR has only been around, the brand has only been around for 3 years. And along with that, what Measuring Success Right, I think we've been doing that for about 1.5 years, maybe almost 2 years. So the fact that we have already seen this kind of growth is pretty phenomenal. And what I'm hoping is that will just continue going sky high, that basically we do become a staple for business students to be able to really have something that they can put on their resume. My goal for this is more for students to have the experience, but also to be able to have a resume builder, something that they can use moving forward, where they can take into account these business communication skills that they gained through writing, through speaking on a podcast, through presentations, that they're able to take those skills and put them into the marketplace.
Yeah. Well, speaking of resumes, that's a big focus for a lot of students. They're trying to develop their resumes as much as possible, and they're trying to be involved in as many things as possible. And Dr. R, on top of G20 and MSR, and I know right now you're working on your law degree, and then on top of that, I know you also help to produce weekly videos on YouTube to help build people's faith. I would love to hear your thoughts on time management. How are you able to balance everything? Do you have any secrets on how to balance our secular pursuits with our spiritual lives and our personal interests?
Boy, this is a really hard question. And I think that one thing to realize too is that we don't compare resumes. I think that's one of the worst things that we can do. And also realize that I'm old. And so, yes, of course my resume is big, just because I've lived longer. And so I think, too, that a lot of times we have this feeling like, I have to do it all now. And my life has truly been different stages. I was a full-time at-home mom with my 12 children. And even though I always loved going to school. And so when my children were in school, I would take a class. And so it took me longer than most to get my master's and my doctorate, just because I would take one class at a time. And then all of my children and I would grab our books and we would all study together around the kitchen table. And for me, I thought that was a positive example, too, for my children. And I've seen them all go on and finish college and go on for graduate degrees, which I think is fabulous and wonderful. But the number one thing that I find in terms of balancing time is to have my spirituality involved in that. So I know that not everybody who's going to listen to this podcast, that, you might not believe in God or Jesus Christ, but I do. And I find that I have them become involved in my decisions in terms of how to use my time. I love to go to the temple. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we believe in temple worship as well as our church worship on Sunday. And when I go to the temple, I find that I go with a little prayer in my heart to help me understand what is most important in my life right then. And that will change depending on the age and stage that you're in. You might find that spiritually, and I do believe meditation, spirituality, that oftentimes you can get these same answers where you try to figure out what is really important in your life right then. And it might be children. It might be doing some help in the community, or it might be taking on a big project like interfaith, and saying, okay, I'm going to save the world. All of those might be different stages that you might have in your life. And so understanding the importance of balance, I think, is the most important thing. Realize that oftentimes in our lives, we can't do it all. We can't do it all at the same time. But our lives are long now. I mean, we are so blessed with good health. If we take good care of ourselves, that we do have the blessing of a long life. And so during that lifetime, you will have different things that you can accomplish. And so the one thing that I love, I always wanted to go to law school, but I was going to go to law school after I graduated from my undergrad at BYU. And I had already taken the LSAT and I was all set, ready to go. And then I met my husband my senior year, and we got married and had a baby 10 months later, and I had 12 children. And it would be difficult for me to have done that goal during that time, because law school is 24/7. It's just, it's just something that really you need to give the time and effort to. And so now, 45 years later, I'm finishing that goal. And so I think sometimes that's the way life is that it might just take time. But I do feel that if you use your spirituality to be able to figure out what's most important during that time of your life, that you will have the opportunities to be able to accomplish, many of the things and goals that you want to accomplish in your life.
Yeah, those are incredible insights. Thank you for sharing those. And I can't help but think, as you shared that memory of you and your kids gathering around the table to study, I can't help but think, wow, how did you pull that off? How did you manage that? And I know as part of your postgraduate studies, you focused on motivation. And I was wondering if you could share maybe just a couple of tips on how we can motivate ourselves and also how we can motivate those around us, how we can be more influential leaders.
Well, that's a really interesting question because my dissertation was a cross-cultural motivational study looking at the motivation to learn of American students versus Russian students. So I had the opportunity to work with a Russian professor, and he did basically a survey that we had. So it had quantitative and qualitative elements because it was a Likert scale survey. But along with that, we also had some very specific questions anecdotally that people could answer. And it was really interesting to do that. One of the reasons why I did that was because of my 12 children, because this whole question that you just brought up of how to motivate people was something that was definitely on my mind while I was mothering these amazing, fabulous children. And so I do think that the one thing that I learned more than anything is example. Example really it's a strong motivating force. And the other thing that I learned is that we are all motivated differently. And I think we talk a lot about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and other kinds of, the donkey and the carrot type of thing, where, we give our children a piece of candy if they do what's right. And, we get an A because we've worked hard. Those kinds of things we can automatically see as quote unquote motivational. But are they really motivational? Are we being forced by other people to do something? Is that truly motivation? And so for me, when we talk about motivation, I think that's a very internal thing. So what may motivate me might be completely different than what motivates you. And I'm talking about something that somebody else isn't forcing me to do or giving me a reward, but something that I inside really want to accomplish. And I have that motivation to do it even without rewards, even without those outside things happening around me. It's just something that I want to do. And so for me, it was interesting to look at all the different motivational theories and to have it be very introspective and to look and say, okay, so what are some of the different things that I find to be motivating? And that's the reason why I think motivation is something that is very personal. I wish we had more motivation classes, but what they would be very different than I think what a lot of people, think of motivation classes. Instead, it would be an opportunity to look at the different theories and then to have this time of introspection to say, okay, I understand these different possibilities. Which one fits me? What fits my personality? What makes, what's really rings true in terms of helping me to be motivated? And I really do feel that if people went through that kind of introspection, they would be surprised as to what they could accomplish in their life. But also, if you're not intrinsically motivated, when those rewards go away, you don't continue forward on that road. Instead, you just stop, you give up, I can't do this. And so you need to figure it out for each person individually. So I wish I had the magic carrot. I wish I had, the magic gold star that everybody could do and be motivated. But I think the beauty of motivation is that it is very individual.
Well, I have a feeling that answer is going to tie into our final question, which, as you know, is how do you measure success? And I know you've already had a chance to answer this question on our show, but I, wanted to give you a chance to answer it again. And also to just ask you if you had any general advice for students as they're moving into this next stage of their lives as they're pursuing success.
I really wasn't saying a false compliment when I said, I love Measuring Success Right podcast, because I do listen to it. I mean, not only am I overseeing it, but I do listen to it. And I have so enjoyed the answers to this question by so many people that I truly do admire. I think of listening to Mitt Romney and what he said when you asked him that question, and Fraser Bullock when he answered that question, and Hal Gregerson, some of these other big names. But I also love the answers of students when you've asked that question, and other people who have answered it all in very different ways. And in many ways, just like you said, it kind of goes with my motivational answer to that question. I will say this, I do feel that we need to be a little more real about what we feel measuring success right is. It would be easy for me to say it's my family, because it is. Measuring success is my family. But we can't completely put to the side the fact that measuring success also does have a worldly component to it. That in order to be able to take care of my family, I do need to have food on the table. And so working hard, working towards a goal, making sure that I'm making a living so that I can provide for my family is also a way of measuring success and is important for family happiness. And so I would say I would kind of change my answer from last time in terms of saying I do feel that measuring success right is having this balance and understanding what that balance needs to be in your life. We do need to have food on the table. We do need to work hard to make sure our families are taken care of. But along with that, we also need to make sure that our families' emotional needs, their love languages are taken care of, that all those other things are also should be high priority on the list. And that goes back to that idea of balance that we talked earlier, that you need to figure out what's most important that day, that week, that month, that year. And as you do so, your success will also change in terms of sometimes you're going to have to just focus on your job. And make sure, especially oftentimes at the very beginning of your career, you need to kind of put more time in that. And that's for your family as well. And so as you look at your life, I think as we plan for success, we need to make sure that we continue that balance that we talked about earlier, but that we also have the right kind of motivation. What is the reason why I'm doing these things? And once we define the why, then we can figure out my success is going to be X. One of my favorite things, I know, Jake, you know this, is I go out to my students and say, where do you see yourself in 10 years? Where do you see yourself in 20 years? Where do you see yourself? And you need to have a vision of where you're going to be, what you're going to do. And I would say it needs to be an eternal vision. You need to say, okay, not just this life, but the next life, those that us that believe that there's a next life. How do you measure success, not just here, but in the future? And for me, that enables you to have that long-term view within the idea of the here and now. So, I also realize that we need to work. We need to have that work ethic. We need to accomplish things, but we also need to have that eternal view of what life will be now and in the future.
Yeah. And as one of your students, that's always been something really impactful about your classes, whether it's a writing class or MSR, is that you encourage us to focus on our purpose. What's the purpose of writing this paper, or what's the purpose of the podcast we're producing? And beyond that, what's the purpose of our careers and even, the purpose of our lives? So thank you, Dr. R, so much for joining us on the show today and sharing those insights.
Oh, Jake, thank you for inviting me again.
This has been another episode of Measuring Success Right. We hope you have a wonderful week.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.